All right, well, I think we'll go ahead and get started since it's 3 o'clock. Thank you all so much for being here. This is the webinar led by Rachel Polakowski and Kathy Kubo on teaching statistics online. Just so you all know, it is being recorded and it will be posted on the CAP website on our publications page, and I will send a link out to everybody after the event. You'll have access to the PowerPoint and you will have access to the recording. Zoom does add closed captioning, but it typically takes anywhere from a couple of hours to a couple of days to add that onto the recording, so that will be there eventually. After the webinar, we'll be sending out a survey on the event, so if you could fill that out for us, that would be fantastic. For now, we're going to turn off the chat. We set this up as a presentation and we got your questions in the registration process. So Kathy and Rachel will be addressing a lot of those questions in this webinar. We should have some time for Q&A at the end, a few minutes. So at that point, I will turn back on the chat so you can ask any questions that remain. Additionally, I'm going to keep everybody muted so we can hear Rachel and Kathy. And I think we're ready to get started. Thank you all for being here.
Okay, welcome. I'm Rachel Polakowski, and we're happy that you're here. I just wanted to add on one additional thing that will be online for you. In addition to this presentation, we've created a resources page with links to various things we're going to bring up throughout the presentation today. So you'll have hyperlinks to a lot of cool resources when we're done. And so now I'm going to turn it over to Kathy Kubo, who's going to get us started with our first topic.
Welcome, everybody. I am going to be talking about the effective side of learning for our students. This is a very, very disruptive time and very upsetting as well for everyone. And so it's even more critical to be attentive to our students' affective needs since their learning environment has drastically changed. Next slide. So as we've been shifting to remote learning, and if you're using Zoom, for example, then it's really important to set norms for our online sessions and interactions. When I started my online sessions, it was very important to set up basic logistics, like having everyone mute when they first check in, and keeping their video cameras off, because many students have issues with having robust internet connections, and so it helps save bandwidth. Also, we would practice how to raise their hand or how to use certain thumbs up or things like that. So we had spent some time just doing the basics. And for our class, we tended to use the chat, although we've been starting to venture into using breakout rooms, which Rachel will explain a little bit later. But even as we try different technologies and ways to communicate online, it's important each time that we do that to give students time to learn how to use the technology and play around with it before I actually assign something. Next slide. Rachel had shared something that faculty are using at her school as they have transitioned to the remote environment. And I thought this was really, really helpful and had great reminders for what's happening now. And I wanted to share this with you as well as reminders as we are planning different lessons and different ways to teach our students, that we keep these things in mind. And one of the first things that students were telling me is that they purposely were not signing up for an online course, and that this disruption was really troubling to them. And I wanted to make sure that students felt supported in this new environment, and that it was going to be okay, that we were going to figure this out together. And so we've made it a priority to be supportive of each other and to try and brainstorm simple solutions that are going to benefit most people. And we want to be able to share resources and be sure that we keep clear lines of communication. It's clear that we can't do the same thing online. So some assignments are just no longer possible in this environment. Some expectations are no longer reasonable, and some objectives are no longer valuable. So we need to keep those things in mind. We also want to make sure that we are providing accessible, synchronous opportunities for our students to gather with us. It's important, I found, to have that routine each week if possible. And we've been able to maintain meeting during our regular class times, but also I want to make sure that I have recorded sessions too. So I record what we do so that students who are no longer able to be with us can still have access to that content. And I also can provide other optional synchronous content to be able to supplement class time, because I have found that things are taking longer, or things change with what I have planned for the day, and we need to spend more time just on getting everybody calm and in a good place mentally to continue their learning. What's most important is to be flexible. We've had to be very, very flexible during the past month, and have to adjust to the situation sometimes very rapidly. Next slide. It's very difficult for some students to be in this remote environment, and it's very easy to feel isolated as well. So what I found to be important is to try and humanize remote learning. It's important for us to have a presence with our students, and before the change to this environment, I wasn't using my video as much, but now I always turn on my video when I'm meeting with my students and recording my Zoom sessions. Seeing my face has been very important to them. They've let me know, and so I try to do that as much as possible. One of my colleagues is recording and posting brief videos of the upcoming week's highlights, and he's been having fun with the Zoom virtual background. So each time he records a new session, he changes his background, and so that's been the way that he makes his online presence. Another important thing to remember is to be available online for your students. I will hold office hours or Q&A hours for my students, and during those times I don't record, but I do want to make sure that students know I am available to them, and I'm also willing to have them book times with me at any other time. So I've met with students very early in the morning. I've also met with students very, very late at night to accommodate their schedules. Next slide. The next point is about intrusive intervention, and how do we reach those students who have disappeared. And so one of the ways that I do this, and it's been very helpful, to use Canvas. So in the grade book for particular assignments, there's a way to message students who haven't submitted the assignment yet. And Lately, I've noticed that students are not taking care of these assignments right away. And as it gets closer to the deadline, I will send out a quick message to just remind them, hey, this is due tomorrow at 11:59. Please make sure you take care of this. And it also gives me an opportunity just to check in with them. Some other options that Canvas offers with this is students have scored less than a set number. Students have scored more than a set number. And then also, I like to send kudos to students who submitted assignments early, and just to let them know that I'm paying attention, I'm noticing, and I appreciate what they're doing. Next slide. Another routine that I've established with my students is a check-in. And so every other week, I have given them this Canvas assignment, and they're used to the first 3 questions in which I ask them to describe what they've learned, write 2 questions that they have about the course material so far, and share an important connection that they've made about the course. The questions that follow will change depending on where we are in the semester. I might check in with them about how they're feeling about an upcoming test, or how they felt about a test that they took. And more recently, I've been checking in to find out what's changed in their lives since we moved to remote instruction. So I'm aware of what their new constraints are. And I've learned so much from what they've shared with me. And that allows me to make adjustments to my assignments, to my deadlines, and to my own expectations of what I want them to do and how I want them to learn. And again, I've had to be very, very flexible to allow for such dramatic changes in their schedule. So it's important, I think, to just ask students, what do they need from us to best support their learning? They are very, very insightful and have shared some great ideas with me. In fact, one of the students had let me know that it would be very helpful for me to post the handouts that I usually give maybe a day early, so that they can have time to look at it, to try it, to print it out before we meet. And so I am very open to accepting those kinds of suggestions, and I want them to share in this process as we figure out what to do. And the most important thing is to be understanding, be flexible, and just be kind, because it is such a difficult time for our students. And what I've noticed is that by doing this, they have expressed such amazing kindnesses to me in return that have helped sustain me during this difficult time as well.
All right. Thank you, Kathy. We're going to talk a little bit about lesson planning now, since that was a concern that was brought up by many of you in the registration. So my biggest suggestion for lesson planning is to work with what you already have. I've been adapting a lot of my face-to-face lesson plans for Zoom or for some sort of asynchronous assignments. So I'm not trying to like revamp everything I'm doing just because now we're meeting on Zoom instead. I'm just adapting what I already have. I try to look for opportunities for student interaction during the lesson. So that's when I'm thinking like, oh, when can I get the students into breakout groups in Zoom? Or how can I use the discussion boards on Canvas to get my students to interact with each other? Because group learning is such an important part of what I do in the classroom, and I want to maintain that in my online instruction as well. And then also to just kind of get creative with what students can do at home. And I have an example of that in one of my lessons that I adapted recently. I have a lesson about calculating confidence intervals. And if you've been to the Summer Institute for CAP or various other CAP events recently, I've talked a lot about this particular activity where in class, I get my students into groups and I give them a cup full of Hershey's Kisses. and they dump them out onto the table, and they're collecting a sample to see how many of the Hershey's Kisses land with their base flat on the table. And then each group calculates a confidence interval, and we report out our confidence intervals on the board. And it's a great way to get them used to confidence intervals. So I was recently looking at that and thinking, okay, well, how am I going to do this online? And I thought, oh, I could do something asynchronous with this. So what I did is I had the students find things that they had in their home that they could use for this activity. Maybe it was pennies. If they had Hershey's Kisses, some of them used Hershey's Kisses. I used coffee beans, and kind of asked them to take a sample of whatever they have around their home, dump it out on their kitchen table, and then define what success is for that sample. For example, the coffee beans that land with their little crease side facing up would be a success. And then I had each student calculate their confidence interval for their own sample and check conditions and go through the same thing we would have done in class. And then they would post their entire results and their calculations and everything on Canvas in a discussion board. So that way they could see each other's work and see, oh, so-and-so did pennies as well. Let's see if our confidence intervals are the same or if we got different ones. So it was a great way to adapt something that they would have done in class, and they were able to do it at home using their household items. I'm not gonna lie, it was a lot of work to set up the discussion board for the students. I created little videos of myself going through what they would be going through step by step, so they could watch the video and see what I'm doing and then replicate it in their house. And then I created a form for them to fill out as they went through their experiment as well, so they knew what would be expected of them to post on Canvas. And you can see on the right here a picture of some of my students' work. And I've published this discussion board to the Canvas Commons, so if it's something that you're interested in, you can import it into your own course and adapt it as you see fit. But I thought it was a great way for me to check for understanding. The class following this was a Zoom meeting, and I had students calculate confidence intervals in breakout rooms. And when they came back, everyone had the right numbers for their confidence intervals. So I felt like this discussion board met my learning goals really well, and it did it in a creative way where they got to be hands-on. So again, I just encourage you to look at what you already would have been doing in class and find ways to adapt it for online. Some tips for success with your online lesson planning is to provide weekly communication to your students. It's very important that you're in contact with them as much as possible. I know at my campus, we sent out a survey to students when this all started, when we transitioned to online. And we said, what's the #1 thing you need and you want? And they said, communication from my teachers. Like, they want to know what's going on and what's expected of them in all of these changes. So weekly communication is very important. You want to give students a sense of how long it's going to take them to do the work, because now a lot more of what they're doing is independently. So give them an idea. Hey, I want you guys to do this before next Sunday, and it's probably going to take you 5 to 6 hours to complete. So plan accordingly in your schedule. As Kathy mentioned, providing materials to students before class is great. If they have a printer, then they can print it out. If not, at least they can have it downloaded to their device and open during class. So that way there's a common handout for all of us to look at. Have a consistent spot in Canvas for students to see, like, where do I go to find my Zoom link for class? Where do I go to find my materials? Have a consistent way of communicating with students how they're going to find these things. And then I also suggest starting or continuing a community of practice to share ideas with your colleagues. We were already doing, the statistics teachers at Cuyamaca were already doing a community of practice that met twice a month, just for a couple hours to talk about how we could become better teachers. And now that we've moved online, we're meeting every week because we realized that the need was there, and this was new and scary and challenging. And so we needed times for us to be able to communicate with each other and talk through it. So those are some tips for success. And then I just have some ways that I communicate with my students that you can adopt or adapt, whatever meets your needs. As I mentioned, weekly announcements are a big thing. So I like to send out a weekly announcement. giving them an overview of what the work's going to be like, about how much time it's going to take, give them a brief introduction to the concepts we're going to be covering, and just to kind of give them a sense of what we're going to be doing. And then I've created a homepage on my Canvas course where I talk about upcoming due dates, when my student hours are, when they can drop in. And then I use the daily diary section to post how they're going to get their Zoom link and what they need for class. So every day that we have a class meeting, I'll post a link in the daily diary that then takes them to a page that says, hey, here's the link for Zoom, here's our schedule for class, here are the materials you need, so make sure you download them. And then this is the same place that I put my recording after class is done. So if they've missed class, they know that they can go to the daily diary and click on the date that they missed, and there will be a recording there for them to watch. So it's all kind of combined in one space. I have a colleague that does the same exact thing in an announcement. She posts announcements every time there's a class with the same information. Here's what we're doing for class. Here's the Zoom link. Here's all the handouts you need. So just kind of putting it in some place that's consistent for students to return to find everything that they would need for the class. All right. And so now I'm going to hand it back over to Kathy to talk about some online resources for you to use for your lesson planning.
We were asked about what kind of materials could we suggest, and so I have three suggestions for you. So let's take a look at the first, which are the Rossmann-Chance Applets, and this shows the complete collection that they have. Next slide. And if you haven't worked with the Rossmann-Chance Applets, they're really great. They're free, and it can simulate many concepts in statistics. It works very well to use it with Zoom to model statistics with students. So here we have an example of tossing pennies and showing how students can build up the distributions and the outcomes of the penny tosses. Next slide. The next resource is from Alan Rossmann, and he has a great blog that focuses on teaching introductory statistics, and it's called Ask Good Questions. So Alan teaches at Cal Poly San Luis Obispo, and he's been a wonderful resource for us in terms of providing really good activities for our students. Next slide. And here's an example of one of his posts from this week, and it focuses on what he believes is the hardest topic to teach in an introductory stats course, which is sampling distributions and sampling variability. And his blog postings are very thorough, and they have great ideas. So I hope you will take advantage of this wonderful resource. Next slide. Finally, the American Statistical Association has created an online teaching resources and discussion site. And the ASA account login is needed, but under these circumstances, they are offering a free trial membership to K-12 and community college educators. So it's a wonderful opportunity to become a member and access all these resources. And so we have the link here for you to be able to access that free membership. Something else that has been very helpful for me, because I've been talking with one of my colleagues about trying to take advantage of all the COVID-19 data that's out there, and I had been looking for information about false positive and false negative information to connect my students to recent news reports. And this just came in my email today with the ASA Connect. And so it will give me a summary of some of the recent postings and responses. And so here, this is exactly what I had been looking for this week. Next slide. And you can see that there's a lot of great information that experts are posting to help instructors who are looking for this kind of material. So I think this is a wonderful opportunity to check out what the ASA has to offer.
Great. Okay. So let's talk about facilitating group work. So I mentioned in my lesson plan that I use a lot of different features, specifically in Zoom, to get my students involved. In the classroom, I'm very focused on low stakes collaborative practice. I don't like to lecture for long periods of time. I'm trying to find more ways for students to get engaged with the content, to talk to each other about math, because I really think it solidifies their learning. And especially in an online environment, and sadly our presentation today is not the best example of it, but lecturing for a long time is hard to keep the attention of the people. So I use Zoom breakout groups, I use Zoom polling, and as I mentioned, I use Canvas discussion boards to get my students engaged with the material and talking to each other. So Zoom breakout groups. I love these because I just think of, again, adapting lessons that I already have for the classroom. If I have my students working on groups in the classroom, then I can easily have them work in groups in Zoom as well. The breakout groups Zoom allows you to randomly assign groups and to choose the size of the groups, or you can choose which students go into each group. And so I really like that feature because I love randomly assigning my students. I love keeping the groups to 3, maybe 4 students. And Zoom does all the work for me. I just tell them how many groups I want to randomly assign it, and boom, those groups are all generated, and I send my students into breakout rooms. When the students are in the breakout groups, the teacher can pop in, which I love because that's a great way to keep things accountable. Like, if I can pop into their breakout group and hear their conversations, I know they're on topic, and I can address any questions that they have. So that's a nice little feature. Just like if I was in the classroom, I could walk around and stop into various groups to see how things are going. I have that same feature available to me through Zoom. Something I didn't learn until I started using breakout groups was that students can request help. I was working with a group during one of my classes, and a little screen popped up on my computer that said, someone in another group is asking for your help. And I said, wow, that's really cool. So I was able to jump into that group and see what was going on. So again, trusting our students to know more about technology than we do, they were able to figure out how to ask me for help, and it just sends me a little notification and I can pop in there. And another cool feature about the Zoom breakout groups is the teacher can broadcast a message to all groups. So things like, hey, I want you guys to wrap this up in about 3 minutes. I can broadcast a message that will pop up on every student's screen in the breakout groups. Or like, reminder, you're only doing numbers 1 and 2 on this worksheet. Don't worry about number 3. So it's a good way for me to make those whole class announcements that I would have made to everyone in the classroom, but using technology instead. So some tips for success. The first time you do breakout groups, I suggest doing something that's very low stakes. Maybe something that doesn't have them calculating or doing anything mathematical at all, but more sharing their opinion. And that way they get a sense of how the breakout groups work. And again, Kathy brought up earlier about setting norms, right? So I do encourage my students to have their videos on, if not during class, but especially during breakout groups. I put in that strong encouragement, not required, but strong encouragement, because I do think that it's nice to be able to see people. It brings that kind of human connection. And then having that low stakes practice allows you as the instructor to see what breakout groups are all about in a very low stakes way, where if it doesn't work out, oh well, nothing was really lost from your lesson. I like to make sure all students have a handout to look at when they're in the group. So again, this gets back to posting your handouts ahead of time in a place where students can have access to them. Because like right now you are all looking at a shared screen, but if I put you into breakout rooms, this shared screen is gone. You don't have access to it anymore. So they need something to be looking at, so that way they can have a common discussion around it. I also set norms for who's going to report out when we come back to the main session. So when I close the breakout rooms and the students are all back in the main session, they should have identified an ambassador in their group who's going to share. So that way I don't have those moments of awkward silence of, okay, who wants to share what they did? And then it's just crickets online and I'm like, is this mic on? Can you guys hear me? By setting this norm of them expecting to come back with an ambassador ready to share, they know who's going to share, they know who's ready to unmute their mic and talk about their work. And then I also like to pause the recording during group work. This is kind of a personal preference, but I do recommend it. I record my sessions, and when you're recording your session in Zoom, the recording follows you, the host. And so if you pop into a breakout room, the recording follows you and will record the conversation that you have with the students in the breakout groups, which I don't think is necessary for the students to watch later if they're watching the lesson later. So I pause the recording while we're in breakout groups. And then when everyone comes back, I restart the recording because that's how class would kind of be. If I'm going around and talking to various groups, the other groups aren't really privy to what I'm saying in those groups. Instead, it's the whole class discussion or closure at the end of the lesson that everyone has access to. And so those are the things that I'm recording. Another feature I like to use in Zoom is the polling. I love this, one, because it's anonymous. So therefore, it's very, very low stakes. So students that maybe aren't comfortable having their video on and you're unsure if they're even out there listening, if you run a poll, you can see if they're responding to your polls or not. It's anonymous on the screen, but later you can go into Zoom and download the results and see which students actually answered which questions. After the students, so the poll just pops up on their screen when you publish it. They get a chance to choose from the options. You're seeing the results in real time, the bars move, and then you can end the poll and publish the results and show the students what the class thought. So I think it's a great way to engage students actively when you're doing more of a lecture format. Thinking about those types of questions where you would ask and again you get crickets from the group. Instead, run a poll and then talk about what the most popular answer was and have a student unmute themselves and say, okay, why do you think that was the most popular answer? What justification do you have for that? You can even use polls to collect data that students could later analyze in some way. So if you wanted to get creative with that, again, you have access to the poll results after the fact to download and look at. Tips for success. You should probably set up your polls before the meeting begins. You can do it during the meeting. It's just a little tedious and takes time. And so it's awkward for the students to wait for you to type something into the poll and then publish it. So I like to go through my lesson ahead of time and think about ways that I can incorporate polls and then set those up on Zoom ahead of time. But, you know, sometimes I don't think of everything and I'm in the lesson and I'm like, oh, I want to ask a question and I want to get their feedback in a way that multiple students can share. So that's when I use the chat feature and I say, hey, I didn't make a poll for this, but let's use the chat feature. Tell me, is this a type 1 or a type 2 error? Type 1 or 2 into the chat feature and we'll see what most of you think. So in a pinch, you can use that. But again, I prefer the polls because it's anonymous and students don't get to see the results until you publish them. And then you've seen a little bit about how I use Canvas discussion boards to moderate student interactions. Some of the cool things about Canvas discussion boards is you can require students to post before they see anyone else's work. So it kind of provides a level of like, they have to be authentic with their own work and their own thoughts when they put their initial post, rather than seeing what everyone else did and kind of mimicking what other people did for their posts. Students can comment on each other's work and help each other out. And it's really easy to grade as a teacher in SpeedGrader. And I can provide feedback to them in SpeedGrader as well with additional comments one-on-one rather than commenting in the whole discussion board if I'm giving them a critique on their learning. Some tips for success is to set clear expectations for student-to-student interaction. If you are asking the students to help each other out and to comment on each other, which I do, I highly encourage you to set up a grading rubric that tells them, like, this is how you're going to get points for your student-to-student interaction. And we did a lot of norming around giving feedback that's meaningful. And just telling a student that they did a good job is not really meaningful feedback. You know, to tell your classmate what you learned by reading their post, or you know, what feedback they could have to improve their post. In my Canvas discussion boards, I like to break the class up into smaller groups. I have about 40 students in a class, and I think if they're all posting in the same discussion board, we just get this long thread of a bunch of posts that students are not going to scroll through and read everyone's posts. So instead, I break them up into groups of about 10. So they're only seeing and replying to the 10 people in their group in the discussion board. It's just a little bit more manageable. So they're not having to scroll through 40 posts. They're only scrolling through 10. And then there's a setting in Canvas to not allow students to edit their posts after they post. And I do this, and I tell them why I do this. And it's because I expect them to correct any mistakes that they make, and it's okay. But I want them to correct their mistakes by replying to themselves, because I want to see their initial thoughts going into things. And if they can edit their post after they've posted it, then I no longer have access to their initial thoughts. I only see their final results of okay, this was the right answer, and now I see that, so I'm going to edit my post. So I tell them that they're going to fix their work by replying to themselves. They won't be able to edit their post once they post it. And it's a little frustrating for them at first, because sometimes they just do like a little typo. And I'm like, that's okay. Don't worry about going back and fixing a typo. It's more about the content. If there's something that you thought it was a type 1 error and you were wrong, reply to yourself and talk about why you were wrong and why now you think it's a type 2 error. We've been doing a lot with hypothesis testing recently, in case you can't tell. And then just another note on discussion boards. I was thinking about how my students interact in class, and a lot of times while students are trickling into class as class is beginning, students are asking each other about like homework questions, or just things from the last class, where they have these kind of casual conversations where there's like individual tutoring going on, which I love. So I had to think about, how can I get that to happen in my online environment? So I created discussion boards that are not graded, but just a forum for students to post any questions they have as they're working through the homework. And that way it's in a place where other students can help them out, or I can jump in and help. And so it's providing that kind of space for individual student tutoring that would have been happening before class, but now in an online discussion board. And one of the added side bonuses of this is it can cut down on your emails as a teacher. So now instead of 5 students emailing you the same question on a particular homework assignment, they can post it in the discussion board and help each other out and see each other's replies. And then that way you're not getting 5 emails. It's all happening in the discussion board. It does take some training for students. The students are going to email you still with a, hey, I have this question on this homework assignment, and your response needs to be, that's a great question. I think that some of your classmates have the same question, so please go post it in the discussion board, so that way it's in a place where other people can see, and I'll jump in there and respond to it if no one gets to it in the next, couple of hours. So just retraining the students to do that. Or if they email you and it's already in the discussion board, telling them, hey, one of your classmates already posted that in the discussion board. Why don't you go check it out? And if your question still isn't answered, post in that discussion board, and we'll get to it as soon as possible. So training the students to kind of move away from emailing you their individual homework questions into more of a forum for them to post their homework questions. All right. And now a little bit on assessments. This was another thing that came up as a concern or a question from you all in the pre-conference registration. So one of the themes that came up was how to minimize cheating. There are some things that I do to minimize cheating amongst students in my online courses. One of the things that I do is I set a time limit for certain assessments, which is a feature that you can do through Canvas. But I also encourage you to be super flexible, especially in times like now. This is not a normal situation that we are all living through. So keeping your same strict requirements for when things need to be done, it needs to kind of be a little bit more flexible than that. So I can't expect my students to complete a quiz or a test during our set class time because maybe my students don't have internet access during my set class time. So again, I can set a time limit, but be flexible about when my students can start the test. So if they can't do it during class time, then I let them take it, you know, at night. I've had situations where students who, before we moved into this online teaching, they had no problems completing their work. I never had to follow up with them. And then all of a sudden, when we started doing online lessons, they stopped coming to my Zoom meetings and they really struggled to get the work done. And I reached out and I said, what's going on? And they said, well, now that I'm home and my parents are home, there's not enough internet bandwidth for me to be able to come to my Zoom meetings and for them to be at work, which also means that this student can't do their homework during the day because it requires internet access as well. So I have to be flexible about when my students can complete assignments. And that's another reason why it's so important to post your recordings for students to watch later. And then another thing too is you can adjust time limits for DSPS students as a way to accommodate them. So if they get extra time, you can adjust that in Canvas. When my students are working on a bigger assessment, like a final exam, I like to disable certain Canvas features. So most of my content is in modules or pages. And so I disable those in the gradebook while my students are working on the final, and it's just, you can go into the settings and disable them. So that way they can't click through previous material while they're taking the assessment. I realize that they have access to the world of the internet and there's only so much I can do. So I encourage you to embrace Elsa and let it go because there's not so much that we can do in this time. And so, you know, if they're going to cheat, they're going to cheat, and I'm going to do my best to restrict it, but I got to let it go. Canvas allows you to moderate the quiz in real time, so you can see when students are taking a quiz on Canvas and how long they've been working on it. And you can give them extra time through that or extra attempts on an individual basis. So that's a very cool feature in Canvas. Please, please, please do not do proctored exams over Zoom. There's so many equity issues with that, you know, and there's so much stress right now in the world that I think it's up to us as teachers to find humane and easy ways for our students to show that they've learned the material. So with that being said, if you're really, 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 really worried about cheating, I strongly encourage you to consider some non-traditional assessments. Because although it might be easy for students to cheat on a traditional math exam, it's not so easy for them to cheat on projects and things. So I'm going to hand it over to Kathy to share some of her ideas.
So for some additional examples, my colleague and I have talked about having students either choose their own data sets or provide multivariable data sets. My colleague is very energetic about this process and wants to provide every student with their own data set so that everybody's got a unique assignment. But if you're not so inclined, I think it's fine to allow the students to choose their own data set. In fact, I had one of my online students ask if that's what we were going to do for one of our assessments. This works very well for exploratory data analysis, for linear regression, and hypothesis testing. I also suggest writing open-ended questions so that students can have multiple ways of looking at a problem and supporting their decision with observations or other information that can make their decision very strong. As Rachel said, it's good to allow for extra time, and I do offer longer time windows for submitting work, especially now that I know students have lost jobs, students are sick, students are having to move home and take care of their parents, and their children are home with them, and so their time availability has changed quite a bit, and I want to make sure that I allow for that flexibility in their schedules. Also, if you're concerned about students cheating or working together, you can set up Q&A time blocks using Zoom to check student understanding. So I often do this in class where I will ask students about what they've turned in, and just to make sure that they're fully understanding what they submitted. And you can easily see who truly understands the material and who doesn't, especially for group assignments. Next slide. So here are some examples that I've used in class. So our exam period was disrupted for my online class, where they were taking their exams on campus, and so we had to switch on the last 2 days to not having them come onto campus, and I decided to have them instead write an essay in which I give them the data set, and they need to generate the dot plots, histograms, and box plots and also the summary statistics to be able to answer this question: do male and female students at this university appear to have similar drinking habits? And I want them to incorporate the ideas from the unit that we had learned. And I also provide them with a grading rubric to help guide their writing, and as a checklist so that they understand what it is that I'm looking for. Next slide. Here's another example from linear regression, in which I provide them with a movie data set that has lots of variables in it, and they need to be able to determine which is a better predictor of Rotten Tomatoes movie ratings, IMDb ratings, or Metascore ratings, and they need to support their answer using the concepts that they learned from the particular unit. Then I also have some other questions once they make their choice of the better linear regression model to check their understanding on topics that we addressed in that particular unit. Next slide. Okay. I'm big on presentations, and I was wondering how well this would work using Zoom, because we had started this particular assignment during face-to-face time, and then we had to quickly transition to the online environment. And so with this project, students were asked to find an infographic that was interesting to them. And in the presentation, they needed to be able to help the audience understand the story behind the data. So it wasn't just finding an infographic, but hopefully finding an infographic that is embedded in an article that provides more information about the data that supports the particular infographic. Again, I remind them that it's important that they choose something that they're really interested in, or something they want to learn about, or something that they want to share because it shows in their presentation. They are also aware that after their presentation, they need to answer questions from me and from their peers about their presentation. Next slide. This assignment also has a second part, which is their post-presentation reflection. So after they give the presentation, I want them to share some of the highlights of their presentation, also provide me with the links so that I have record of that. And I want them to think about how was the presentation? How did it go for them? What did they learn from that process? And how did they think they could have improved? I also asked them to just give me a sense of what's the grade that they feel that they earned. And I find just hands down, they underestimate their performance. And they often give themselves much lower grades than what I would give them. Next slide. So here are some examples of what my students did for me this semester. So they're giving a 3 to 5 minute presentation on this, and it worked beautifully in Zoom. I give them the option to either turn on their video or not turn on their video. And for students, I have a deaf student this semester, and what he did was he did a video of him signing his presentation. He also embedded the infographic into his video, sent it to me ahead of time, and then we were able to show that and have the interpreters be able to verbalize that for the class, and it was amazing. So it's incredible what their tech skills are if they have that leeway to show that. So here we see, oh, can you go back? Here we see that students had chosen topics that were actually relevant to either what we had just discussed or what we were about to discuss. So this student had found this scatter plot on the left. Another student wanted to focus on COVID-19 and how people will get their news either from social media or other news sources. And then the last one, a student had chosen this right before we talked about stacked bar charts and shared his passion for aviation. Next slide. A couple of students had decided to venture into more challenging topics, but very, very important discussions that we had around this afterwards. So one was about suicide rates around the world. Another one was about mass shootings. After this presentation, another student had wanted to piggyback off this and talk about PTSD. And the reason why she had wanted to do this was because she had been shot at the Las Vegas mass shooting and wanted to share her experience. And so I found that with these presentations that not only are students able to demonstrate what they know about the content that they've learned or delve into something new, but it also gives them an opportunity to share something that's very important with them and has actually connected our community in the classroom even more, even though we've moved to online.
Okay, great. And so Summer, I think, is going to help us facilitate some questions.
Yes, I will go ahead and open up the chat. And so if you guys have any questions, go ahead and type those in, and then I will scan them and read them to Rachel and Kathy. And thank you both. That was super helpful to me, even as an English person.
Oh, good.
Okay, here's a question. How do you manage presentations for students who can't be present during Zoom?
I think what I would do is I would ask them to be able to meet with me. Let's find a time where we could do a Zoom session and I could record their presentation and then show it during class. We are also having another issue. A student of mine has internet issues. And so the audio was problematic when he tried to present last night. And so we're actually in the middle of coming up with plan B and plan C. So he was going to try and record the audio for me and send it to me in advance and see if we could make that work. But if that doesn't work, then we'll figure out something else, and it's fine to extend the deadline. Students were supposed to present by last night, but under these conditions, this can't be helped, and so we just figure out other ways to make it work.
I see a question about if this webinar will be recorded. Yes, I will share that info at the end of the session. Here's a question for Rachel. Are Cuyamaca's in-class activities available for everyone?
Yes, our activity packet is going to be posted on a resources page that we share with you all. We have a box that we put everything in. So yes.
Okay, how did you transition students from working on handouts together in groups during class to remote learning? Are they still responsible for the workbook on their own? And this was for Rachel specifically.
Okay, so the way that my class is usually structured is the workbook is actually something we always did in class. It was never something that they did on their own. And their homework, it was always what they did on Canvas. So I have reading in Canvas and discussion boards in Canvas and quizzes in Canvas that my students were already doing in my face-to-face classes. And then when they come to class, they do the workbook together with us. So that hasn't really changed. They bought the workbook at the beginning of the semester, so they all have it. And so I just tell them, hey, when you come to the Zoom meeting, make sure you're all looking at page 120. And I actually share from my tablet, I share page 120 on the Zoom screen. So they're looking at the handout on our Zoom conversation while they're also doing it in front of them when we're in our whole class meeting. So that way they can kind of follow along with what I'm doing. And then when they go into their breakout groups, they all have the handout with the questions on it. And they can say, okay, this is what I'm doing for number 4. And we all know what number 4 we're talking about. So for things like I mentioned that I'm supplementing or coming up with in addition to their workbook, I post those handouts ahead of time and ask them to download them, print them if they can, but if not, at least have them on a screen so they can look at the questions when they're working in groups together. I hope that addressed the question.
Okay, there's a question about the OLI. For colleges that are using OLI with the LMC activity book, is there a Canvas shell for the online version of statistics with support that you can share?
There is. I'll have to talk to Los Medanos about access to that. I don't know where it lives on the internet. I know it's out there somewhere. But I'll talk to Myra Snell about that and make sure that if you want to import that, you can. I've posted the Cuyamaca one, which is very similar to LMC's. So if you want to take a look at that, I've posted both access to our entire Canvas course and our Canvas support course. So stats and support, you have access to both in our resources page that I'm going to send out. But I will add in the LMC one if I can get that information for you.
Kathy, there's a question for you. It says you have great examples. Will you be able to share the data?
This information, or actually these come from the OLI and Canvas, and where the data sets are. If you specifically want me to send you just the data sets, just email me and I can do that. But we are going to try and find the LMC link for their materials, and the ideas that I've gotten for my projects actually come from their materials, which they provide for instructors.
I know you addressed this, but if you want to add anything, it says cheating is a big issue in the math classroom. How do you recreate the act of proctored test taking online or the integrity of assignments? This is a big question in our department right now.
I've embraced Elsa and I've let it go. I've let it go. I do what I can, but I'm not proctoring exams for the students. As I mentioned, I think it's an equity issue to have a Zoom proctored exam for students. So I'm trying, as we mentioned, we're trying to find ways to assess student learning that isn't a traditional test. And therefore we don't have to worry so much about cheating. If you're using more open-ended questions or projects, it's a lot harder for students to cheat their way through those things. So that would be my encouragement for you all. But if you're insisting on giving traditional tests, I think you're going to have to let go some of your previous abilities to proctor what's going on in the classroom because of the given circumstances. I know that's not the answer you want. Sorry.
Okay. All right. There's a lot of comments, but I think that wraps up the questions. So just to let you know, as I mentioned in the beginning, but I think some of you might have come on a little bit after that, this will be recorded and posted on the CAP website on the publications page, and I will send a link to everyone. Additionally, all the resources will be linked there as well, including the PowerPoint. I think the chat does get recorded as well. So some people are sharing some resources in there, so you can look through that as well. Thank you very much to our presenters, Kathy and Rachel. We really appreciate you, and thank you all for being here.
Thank you very much.
All right. Thank you so much.